So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us for our second synchronous session in our fall part of the TPS Civil Rights Fellowship. And today we have several speakers with us, and I want to be able to kind of jump right into the program. So our first speaker is Dr. Carroll Van West, who is the director here at the Center for Historic Preservation. And he is also the director for the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area. Was editor for the Tennessee Encyclopedia and has been a state historian since 2013 here in the state of Tennessee. His preservation focus is on properties associated with the Civil Rights Movement, Civil War, rural areas, marginalized communities, and the Southern music industries. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. West.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm going to share my screen now and just jump right into my presentation, and then we'll be happy to discuss anything you wish when I'm done. Okay, what I wanted to review for you is this legacy from Reconstruction that is found throughout African-American communities throughout the United States. I first thought about going national on this, and I have moved into the West, but I didn't really truly go national because Kira also told me it was 25 to 30 minutes, not 2.5 hours to 3 hours. So I did dial it back a bit. I have been very honored to be asked by many different African-American communities to work on this issue in the last 25 years of my career. It began with the Nutbush community in Tennessee, which is famous for many reasons. It's an early African-American community. It was also the place where Tina Turner began her musical career. And from working with that community and that congregation, I really did learn so much, and it's been a journey ever since. So I'm going to share some highlights of that journey with you today. There is one National Park Service site devoted to the story of Reconstruction. It is new. This was created in the last decade in Beaufort, South Carolina, and Penn Center, South Carolina. I show you the headquarters above, one of the historic buildings at Penn Center below. This was a long time in the making. I can recall going there and doing a workshop with the Gullah Geechee National Heritage Area, 10, 15 years ago. And then Mike Allen, who was a Park Service ranger for many years, just took this on and decided to make it a mission of his before he retired. And he did see this all the way through. Mike spoke at countless meetings about the need for a federal designated National Historic Site to tell the Reconstruction story. So that's one place you should always go to, because this property, like a lot of the ones that I'm going to share with you, follow a pretty simple storyline. It's the long civil rights movement story, and it is from Civil War to civil rights. So this is a good site to show you that, with the emancipation of enslaved people there in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, the communities they created, and the communities they have nurtured and developed ever since the 1860s. It's a story that not enough people know, and not enough people even recognize its importance. So I certainly urge you to go there. Where I want to sort of shift, though, to is more local stories, because I think you can find these in so many places across the nation, certainly in the South, but also in many other parts of the country as well. In the South, you have the issue of contraband camps. These were facilities created by the federal government and the U.S. Army during the Civil War to help them deal with the number of enslaved people who self-emancipated. They ran away from plantations and farms and towns and cities as fast as they could when the Union Army approached during the Civil War. So they would go to these places seeking safe haven behind the lines of the US Army. The federal government called them contrabands because legally, of course, they were enslaved people and property, according to the Drew Scott decision of the Supreme Court just a few years earlier. And they really didn't know what to do with them. Now, a lot of the camps basically self-organized themselves quite quickly into their own communities. And one thing that I have found fascinating, those communities still exist today in roughly the same place, some, 160 years later. So this is the best example in Tennessee, is the community of Grand Junction. And it developed as a contraband camp. In fact, the first created in Tennessee by General U.S. Grant in 1862, because it was a junction point of two major railroad lines that the U.S. Army wanted to take control of, therefore the name Grand Junction. And the depot of the town still sort of stands there today to remind you of its railroad history. But just on the other side of the tracks was the contraband camp that the federal army set up for the escaped slaves, some 2,000 of them fairly quickly. And today at that same general location, there is a fraternal lodge up in the upper left corner next to a 1950s, what we call equalization school. This was a school built for African-American children in this town as a way of saying, hey, separate can be equal. We don't need to change anything in the South in the 1950s. And then across the street is the institution where everything sort of grew out of, Pleasant Grove Missionary Baptist Church. Now, we knew of this location, we knew of these landmarks, and people could share stories with us. And as we got into searching primary sources, finding maps, detailing those maps, overlaying maps with information that we found out, we found that the actual contraband camp still survives, is intact, and it's the site of the town's segregated African-American cemetery. Now, cemeteries there are not segregated now, but in the historic period before 1965, they were. And this cemetery just has so many names and so many stories to tell. The stones are evocative of African-American craftsmanship, both from masonry craftsmanship to just an artistic bent, as you can see from this Mr. Joe W. Hurd monument carved into concrete. These are invaluable places to explore. I find them captivating myself. My students just are always their jaws drop about these properties because they are in a very historic place, but then there are the names there that tell so much. And one thing that we have seen that is formed out of the contraband camps are these key institutions, schools, churches, fraternal lodges, and cemeteries. And often you find those still together today. One of our best examples, and one that we really have worked with quite a lot over the last 15 years, is named Promised Land. That's its name. It's in Middle Tennessee, not too far from Nashville. And Promised Land was a place that we found really by accident. We were researching the iron industry in Tennessee during the Civil War, which depended totally on enslaved labor. And in fact, the largest slave owners in Tennessee were in this industry, owning in some cases 300 enslaved laborers. So we're out driving roads and I see the name Promised Land. And I just think, let's go down that road. And this is what we found. A church, a school, and a cemetery. And we found out that Promised Land was so named by the formerly enslaved laborers of the mines who created this community near the mines in 1866. And it was still very much a thriving community today, centered on the Promised Land School that was built in 1906. We started working with this community to list the school, the church, and the cemetery in the National Register of Historic Places. And then the community started to share. They shared quilts, and this was their freedom quilt, one that told the story of emancipation in many different ways. And they decided, what do you think we should do with this? And it was like, well, if you want to, I would share it. And I would share it in this school and always tell its story. So they have worked with us in the years since to turn the school into a community museum and community center. So Promised Land has become a name that is known sort of throughout Middle Tennessee for their remarkable story and their wish and ability to tell that story and always stay in control of the story. And that is something too that we have learned in working with all of these communities on their historic preservation projects. It is first an honor to be asked to work with them. And then what we're doing is really working for them. We want to find out what these communities wish to accomplish, how they want to tell their story, how they want their buildings and properties preserved. And then it's up to us to work with them to find those solutions. So it's been a real reciprocal type of relationship and invaluable to, I think, everyone involved. It is an ongoing process with all of these projects. Probably the best example of that to shift you to now outside of Tennessee is the Shiloh community in Macon County, Alabama. Macon County has the highest percentage of African Americans of any county in the Alabama Black Belt. It is the home of Tuskegee University and also the home of this remarkable community known as Shiloh, which is about 8 miles north of Tuskegee, nearer the small town of Notasulga. And here we began again with the cemetery. It is the oldest resource in the town. It dates to 1870. There's a remarkable headstone for a child in the cemetery that was really built like a ceramic jug that dates to 1881. The members of the community believe that they got the land in 1870. There's no headstones left for those early members of the community buried there, but you do have a remarkable cemetery that again tells such a great story. Then there's the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church. This building was built in 1916, sort of in the third generation of the community's development, and it has remained there now for the last 100 years. It is truly a community landmark. It's a beautiful building with its soaring bell tower, and then interior, there's all types of really remarkable woodwork, painted woodwork. And the first time I went there, my jaw just dropped because of the significance of the architecture of the building. But then you started to find out from the community members the significance of their story. At that time, they were really centered on the Rosenwald School that stood next to the church. The church had provided the land for the Rosenwald School, and they were undergoing a partnership with Tuskegee University and Auburn University to restore it, but they didn't know how to list it in the National Register of Historic Places, and that's where they asked us. Well, after listening to their stories, visiting the properties, we said all 3 properties should be in the National Register, and we want to really find your story and share that and get this landmark done. And then you find out as you work with the community and build trust and with everyone, they're willing to share sometimes some very upsetting stories. In the Rosenwald School and the church, they have done a wonderful job of restoring the building. They provide tours of the Rosenwald School. These 4 women were all students during segregation at the school. They serve as the primary guides to the building. And this is something that your school can arrange a trip down there to have a tour of this building, the cemetery, and the church, provided by folks who actually lived there and walked there and went to that school. And part of the upsetting story that they will provide is the story of what is known in a lot of circles as the Tuskegee syphilis study. But let there be no doubt, it was the U.S. Public Health Service's syphilis study, where they used 600 African-American men, told them they were treating them for illness, and they did nothing but monitor the progression of syphilis in these men until they died. Chilling documents about this abound. The primary sources can be a bit difficult, I think, for anyone to address, but among those, there is one in particular where one U.S. Public Health Service official said, you know, the real value of these men are when they're dead. We want their bodies to autopsy. That was the whole purpose of the study. And it's a gruesome story. It's a sad story. If you want to know why African Americans in Alabama are still resistant to the idea of vaccination, it would trace exactly back to this story here. So a story that was powerful and important 2 years ago is even more so today in understanding sort of contemporary public health issues. They tell the story through an exhibit in the school building. And they don't pull punches. They tell you what it meant to them, and then they take you to the cemetery where some of these men, particularly the one there on the right that you can see a photo of him from an Ebony magazine's expose about the study in 1973. He was Charlie Pollard. And the Public Health Service, to show how callous they were, they took close-up photos of men being, their blood being drawn, just so they could show what they were doing. They really did not care about these men. And of course, that was the 1950s, a whole different era from today. But it is a powerful story to understand, to interpret, and I think they do so in a very compelling way at Shiloh. Okay, shift directions to another part of the South. And this is the sort of South Carolina upcountry. It's not near the coast. Palmyra is closer to Georgia than it is any place else. But there's the story of the Hope community. And again, you see this same pattern of emancipation communities of African Americans once enslaved, quickly rushing to create churches, schools, and cemeteries. Now, everything at Hope centered around St. Paul's AME Church. Now, it's been rebuilt many times. This building is from the 1950s. And then the next oldest part of the story there is their cemetery, which has some real distinctive sort of South Carolina traits with all of the gravel over the graves. You can see some of that there. But it also has tombstones that really tell a powerful story, from the one on the right with the carved hands, but particularly the one on the left of Noah Sumner. This is an area known for its woodworking and known for its timber. And here in this tomb for an enslaved man, he would have been a teenager at the time of emancipation. He lived until 1922. They show an axe, which speaks right back to what he was probably trained at and what he was good at upon emancipation. Now, Hope is now nationally famous because of the school. It's a school that few people probably have visited. I know when I took a group one summer out there, it was like people at the church was like, well, yeah, we would like for you to come, but no one much comes to this place. Now, it's in the middle of nowhere. And it's like, yeah. I know that all of that is true, but this is one of the reasons I want to come. They know they're more on the map than they were before, though, because they donated the original school sign and some of the original school desk and their potbelly stove to the National African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. And they used that at the museum as their place to tell the story of the Rosenwald School program. So I think that's great. I think the museum is great. I think this is a good exhibit. But, to me, to understand that school, you need that cemetery and that church next to it as well. All of those institutions work together. So now I'm going to take you to a place that has been very much in the news in the last 2 years, and that's the Greenwood District of Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's scene of the 1921 Tulsa massacre. Now, this is a very powerful place to go to. It gets into the creation of urban enclaves for African Americans after the Civil War during Reconstruction. And certainly in Tulsa, African Americans came to this western state of Oklahoma thinking they would have freedoms and opportunities that were very hard to achieve in the South. Other groups of African Americans had gone into Kansas and Nebraska. And in Tulsa, though, they met with great success. And of course, this eventually led to the white violence in the district that destroyed it. And when you go to Greenwood today, you do find different markers explaining what happened there. All of these are recent. When I first went to this district of 12 years ago, there wasn't any historical marker. It was like no one wanted to talk about it, except once you started to talk to people, they were happy to talk about it. They were just surprised any white person even came there to find the story. Well, that's changed. And now this story of the Black Wall Street is told not only in historical markers, but also in this very powerful mural of what the district looked like at the time of the riot. And it says, Black Wall Street forever. It's a statement of identity and defiance. It's a statement of purpose and resistance. And the battle here is far from over, in my opinion, because it wasn't just what the riot did to the neighborhood in 1921. It is what interstate construction and urban renewal did to them in the 1960s and 70s. There's the mural on the building, one of the few buildings to have survived. And you can see an interstate just runs right by the district, cutting it off from any neighborhoods all around. In other words, there was generations of violence against this neighborhood. And that's why I think when you look at the urban phenomenon of emancipation neighborhoods, you have to look for the impact of urban renewal in the mid-20th century. We could go to Jefferson Street in Nashville and see similar types of just, it's horrific violence. In Jefferson Street, they just drove the interstate through the middle of the neighborhood, much like they did in Tulsa. So this is where understanding these places, their significance and their stories, I think is really crucial. You do still have some real prominent landmarks. The Vernon AME Church is a beautiful building. I just love those two domes on either side of the bell tower. And then there are some people who are making their own statements. Here at the Bryant Building, they took bricks that had been, from the burning of buildings and used them to decorate their facade to again say, this happened, we're not going to let it be forgotten. And in that sense, they remind me of the community there in Shiloh, Alabama, where they don't want that story of the syphilis study to be forgotten. Here, they don't want the violence of 1921 forgotten. Now, there has been, and this is why I was there, they had just opened up this museum. And in fact, you can see they're still doing some work to the exterior of it. And they opened this up in this fall. And the museum does tell a powerful story in place. It talks about Jim Crow. It talks about sundown towns. It talks about lynching. It talks about these events on the long road from Civil War to civil rights. It documents the buildings that were once there and have been, torn down, destroyed, but not forgotten. So, those places, I think, are Shiloh and Greenwood. They're so important because they're tied to nationally important events. But I know my colleagues are going to take up the mantle here in a few minutes and talk about a really interesting development that's happening in Franklin, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville, and that's in the Natchez Street district. Long an African-American neighborhood, is actually on part of the Battle of Franklin battleground. And after emancipation, several of the enslaved from the Carter family just built homes in this area. They acquired land, built homes, and started to build a neighborhood and then a community that thrived throughout the period of Jim Crow. And now the residents are determined not to be forgotten, as Franklin, as the whole Nashville area, is so changing because of economic development. Now, this is the Merrill Williams house. I first had the opportunity to explore it in depth in January because the family was considering selling it, and it probably would have been torn down and some type of 3-story condo put in its place. But the family was willing to consider alternatives. So we got together and started to work on that alternatives. Yeah, the building needed some work, but I don't know what historic building doesn't need work. And it became a matter of finding out best options. Across the street was a similar structure, the Gaylor House, known because of the Green Book, the book that was produced to guide African-American travelers to safe places during travel in the Jim Crow era. This was the one place listed for Franklin, Tennessee, the Gaylor boarding house, this very simple stone structure. And on the inside, it's a simple house. It's got 2 rooms to it. But then to the left was the lodging room, which looks just like a sort of standard motel room from the 1950s. So here was a building that served travelers through the neighborhood that still stood in Natchez Street. And of course, people now recognize the importance of the Green Book. So these are projects that then we were asked, what can happen? What can you do? How can you help? And we just asked, what do you need? We need reports that tell people and explain to people why these matter and what can be done with them. So in the first half of the year, we produced those 2 reports. And the good news is for the Merrill Williams property, there's been $1.5 million already raised for its preservation. And the same process is now underway for the Green Book House. So they can be preserved as community institutions, as neighborhood heritage centers for African-American history and culture. So I want to end on this sort of optimistic note, since I brought up some sort of troubling instances. These places exist. They can tell powerful stories, and you can knit together coalitions of people that want to work together to save them, preserve them, and let them tell their stories for generations to come. I think there's a lot of places like this. across the South. And I always say, you have to put your feet on the streets, go talk with people, and it's unbelievable what people will share with you if you just go and show respect and want to explore the history of this story, not just in the South. This is from Leland, Mississippi, but throughout the nation. So that's the end of the presentation. I'll be glad to take any questions that you might have.
So if anybody has a question, if you either want to drop that in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions.
I have a question. I actually grew up probably 20 minutes from that Hope School, and I had no idea it existed. How do you know how we would go about setting up a visit over there? Because that's probably an hour from our school.
I'll send you the information I used for my visit 2 or 3 years ago. You know, with COVID, you get your messed up on time. It might have been 3 years ago. It seemed like 2 years ago, but
Okay.
I'll send you that. I'll send it to Kara, and Kara can send it on to you.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question. So with the Natchez community, what's available there? Like if I brought students out to that community, we do learn about the Green Book in my class. It's in the curriculum. We do go to Jefferson Street. We do know that a lot of them Green Book houses aren't standing anymore. So that it'd be really cool to visit, but is it just driving through, or is there any programming or anything that is available?
That's under development right now, and probably the panel after me will talk about that. I will say that we did work with the shorter AME church owns the building, and they will open it up for groups. They do it on a regular basis. We did provide a brief history of the building to provide to groups. They don't have, you know, an education program per se, but you can get a tour of the building and the students can get more information. But on that, I know that there's planning in the next 2 years to really ramp up what people can gain by going to that Natchez Street area.
Yeah, and my other question is, I went to that archaeology dig for Bass Street community. And so I've been really interested in, maybe that's right across the street from my school. And I know there's nothing really standing there, but you could kind of see where the church was. The cemetery is nearby, like what you said. I'm not sure what school would be connected to that community, but the interstate runs right through, just, you know, all these patterns that you've been mentioning. I reached out to the archives, and there's not really anything written about. They couldn't find anything about the Bass Street. I know I guess my question is, how do you go about researching it so that you can build something to teach and share?
Okay, now Bass Street Missionary Baptist Church still exists. It's out on White Creek Pike. So they moved out there, and I don't know what type of church history that they might have available. I just don't know that. I do know that there is a pretty comprehensive planning document being developed for the Fort Negley area right now. And, you know, hopefully they'll have more information on the primary sources associated with that. I know I have looked at that area and how it was impacted by interstates and demolition and urban renewal through the Sanborn fire insurance maps. And some of those are available on the Library of Congress's website. To your other question, what is the school? The school nearest that is Cameron. Cameron is now middle school. It was Cameron High School. And historically, the other school that was close to that neighborhood was Meharry Medical College. The first location for Meharry was there next door to Cameron School.
I did not know that. Great. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Dad, when are the subs gonna be ready? 15 minutes. Oh, you're right.
Well, Dr. West, thank you so much for your time this evening and for joining us. We really appreciate your presentation. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Graham, who is going to introduce our panelists for this evening.
Yes. Thank you to everyone who's here, especially our guest panelists. Before I introduce them, I'm just going to quickly go over how the rest of this is going to go. Each of our panelists are going to talk for about 10 minutes or so about their research. And of course, we've selected them because they have each done research onto the specific sites that you have all seen in your virtual field trips. So first is going to be John Lodl, whom you'll recognize from the videos talking about the cemetery community and benevolent cemetery. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Crystal deGregory, who can tell us so many things about Fisk and the history of HBCUs. And then we're going to hear from Laura Holder, who has worked for many years, particularly in Franklin, on sites just like the Merrill Williams House and some of the other kind of similar neighborhoods there. So we are going to go in that order. John Lodl, of course, is our Rutherford County archivist who just wrapped up a wonderful new museum exhibit that we have at our historic courthouse here in Rutherford County. So congratulations on that, John. He is currently, he decided he couldn't get enough of us, so he's back at MTSU getting his PhD in public history, doing even more research into African-American communities, particularly in Rutherford County. And then Dr. Crystal deGregory is currently research fellow with us here at the Center for Historic Preservation. Like I mentioned before, she's done extensive research into historically Black colleges and universities, particularly Fisk, where she herself got her bachelor's degree and then went on to get her master's and PhD from Vanderbilt. Laura Holder is going to be our final panelist. She's one of my colleagues here at the Center for Historic Preservation. She is the federal liaison for the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area, which is one of the federal programs that is administered through the CHP. And she actually wrote her master's thesis on the history of and the preservation efforts of the Natchez Street Historic District in Franklin. So she has a wealth of experience working with the community that you saw in the video, as well as others there in the area. So John, you're going to start us off, and then after each of our panelists have talked a bit more about their research, we're going to open it up to Q&A. So while they're talking, if you want to, again, drop any questions or comments that you have in the chat box, then we'll get to those when they're all wrapped up. So John.
All right. Hey, y'all, you can hear me okay? Okay. So y'all saw some videos, and I was the star of one, I guess I should say. Down here in Murfreesboro, we have two very unique kind of projects that are going and ongoing, and that I've been able to be a part of that speak to today's topic, you know, African-American history, culture, heritage, these small pocket communities, and what you can do about that. You know, where can you learn more? How can you use these elements and these histories to in the classroom to educate your students and pique their interest and push them out in the community to learn more, right? And, you know, Dr. West really was a great kickoff I'm a student of Dr. West, currently working on my PhD on the side. I think Dr. Graham may have mentioned that. And so I kind of grabbed some notes from 2 recent papers I wrote for him, for Dr. West over the past year. One specific to what will be my dissertation research on historic African-American churches, and then one I wrote on African-American cemeteries. Of course, I'm landlocked here in Rutherford County, so everything I talk about is centric to right here in Murfreesboro and Rutherford County. But you know, the concepts apply almost anywhere, as you'll find out here shortly from my other colleagues. So the idea of, you know, cemetery, studying a place like cemetery community or benevolent cemetery is, you know, why are we going to these places? And it's I think to give voice and agency to an underrepresented history that needs to be told. And of all the examples that Dr. West gave, it's a congruent story over and over again. You have these small African-American communities, what's left of them sometimes, maybe it's a church, maybe it's a school, maybe that's the same building, maybe there's a cemetery, maybe there's a lodge building, etc. And what can these little communities tell us today? And what can we learn from them? Cemetery here in Murfreesboro is a fascinating place. I better say cemetery community every time because you'll get confused what I'm talking about. So we have this amazing community that you saw in our video called Cemetery Community, called Cemetery because it was right beside or developed right beside the National Cemetery there at Stones River Battlefield. And so hence the name. But Cemetery Community started as a contraband camp. It's one of those Tennessee contraband camp stories, one of the major stories of contraband camps, especially in the mid-state. Where this contraband camp forms during the Civil War, and then after the war, the African Americans stay. They don't go anywhere. They build 3 historic churches. They build a school that has a legacy of buildings. They have their own cemetery. It was particularly called Evergreen Cemetery. And some of those citizens are still there today. Some of the descendants of those first ancestors are still there today. And so there again, one of the teachers here asked the question of, well, where do I find that story for something? Where are the records? And I guess that's our goal and that's our job. You know, these are places that the story wasn't written down. Very much of, all these communities are legacy stories where, just like in times of enslavement, African Americans didn't have much voice and agency on what was recorded about them. And that legacy plays through Reconstruction and Jim Crow, where there's not a lot of documentation to be found and sometimes not a lot of buildings left to be discovered. And so Cemetery Community, for example, of the 3 churches, there's only one true historic one still left. There is another church building, but it's slightly newer. It's not the original building. The cemetery is still there, of course. There is a 1940 school building that will hopefully be restored someday, still on premises there, as you saw in the video. But there's, most of the houses are gone, most of the people are gone. So you can drive right by it, blink an eye, and not realize that this is an important location in Middle Tennessee. For benevolent cemetery or African American cemeteries in general, there again, I think you have to plant your feet on the ground in a cemetery, historic cemetery, and start looking around. Stacey Graham's smiling because she knows what I'm talking about because she does a lot of cemetery research. But, African Americans at all historic cemeteries, particularly African American cemeteries, are unique. They tell a unique story. They have a unique story to tell. And when we study with Dr. West, he teaches us all about material culture and understanding, be able to read the landscape and to see what material culture that people left behind. And what's so unique about a place like Benevolent Cemetery here in Murfreesboro is, first of all, it's a space claimed by African Americans at a time when, to dumb it down, the world was against them, right? In the middle of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, with so much adversity, these African American cemeteries were places where African Americans took a stand. You can still see where they took a physical stand against white supremacist society to stake a claim, to bury their dead, but to also, which gives a history of agency, it's not just about burying the dead, but it's tying the dead to the living or the living to the dead, the spirituality that comes with that, the religious connotations that come with that. And it was a place that African Americans had to stand firm and fight back against the world against them, and to leave a legacy for their descendants, for the next generations. And so that's why we can go to places like Benevolent Cemetery or any African American cemetery and start to read the landscape, understand the history, start to see the names, if there are tombstones, and the dates, and understand what those people were going through that are buried there, and what they had to fight against or what they had to benefit from and give to the society around them. I grabbed a couple of quotes that I wrote in a couple of papers for Dr. West. He once was quoted saying that African American cemeteries are, quote, great testaments of faith and symbols of resistance. And what you have to quickly understand is, yeah, that's totally true, that these African American cemeteries, they matter. They represent the material culture and the social constraints that are truly unique to African American history, culture, and heritage. So by understanding why the tombstones aren't always grandiose, why African American cemeteries stereotypically tend to be more neglected than historic white cemeteries. Not always true, but often true. It all plays into that broader history of what was going on during Reconstruction and Jim Crow, but also legacies of it, through civil rights and beyond, even today, as we try to, as Dr. West said, stumble upon these communities, get into the community. Here's the important key: work with the community to dig up those histories. And then, as Dr. West does best and shows the students the best, what do we do to preserve those stories? So the Center for Historic Preservation leads the charge in the nation. I would argue, especially in the African American side of things, to do National Register nominations, to do museum presentations and exhibitions, to do pamphlets and publications, and to obviously do outreach, different types of community outreach, this included, to get those lesser known stories better told and better preserved. So I'm kind of rambling here, which I do very, very well. So I'm going to kind of stop and let everybody else talk, and maybe we wrap it all back up at the end.
Thanks, John. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. deGregory.
Hi there. I want to talk to you a little about Fisk as a site of Black construction. For the White South, there was the restoration of Reconstruction, but for the Black South, this was an incarnation of what it would mean to be both Black and American. The late poet Maya Angelou dubbed this phenomenon the hope and the dream of the slave. But John Hope Franklin, who was rather a graduate of Fisk University's class of 1935, who coincidentally was the son of Buck Colbert Franklin, an attorney who defended the survivors of the Tulsa massacre. In his seminal book, From Slavery to Freedom, describes the building of Black America in three critical steps. The first being the Black church, the second being Black schools, and the third being other institutions. Founded in the shadow of the Civil War as the Fisk School or Fisk Free Colored School, this situates Fisk as foundational in the building of Black America, in the fulfillment of the promise of Reconstruction and civil rights, and as such, inextricably linked from the story that is American history. Now, dubbed a moment in the sun by American sociologists, thinker, and arguably the best mind the American nation has ever produced, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, or W.E.B. Du Bois for short, the enduring value of Reconstruction to Black schools turned colleges is undeniable. In fact, Du Bois himself is a testament to that ever-present value. As a 1888 graduate of Fisk, Dr. Du Bois was the first Black person to earn a PhD from Harvard University, but said of his education there, "I did not find better teachers at Harvard, but teachers better known." In order to appreciate the value of a place such as Fisk, it's important to place the school within the broader context of American history. Now, Black people in the colonies turned states could largely neither read nor write, either because of law or custom prohibited literacy. Most white Southerners were also illiterate and were by and large resistant to public education as a rule. It was the desire of the freedmen and women for education and the establishment of freedmen schools to meet their needs that led to truly public educational systems across the South. Fisk is just one of the more than 100 institutions which survived against all odds and persist today as historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, which is a federal designation. As the oldest institution of higher education in the city of Nashville, Fisk is a living history museum. I arrived at Fisk in the fall of 1999. There, I met a campus that is physically much like what a visitor would meet today, given that there's only been one new campus construction in all that time, and it's just now being erected. What you will find is a host of historic buildings, ranging from the Little Theater, which was converted from Union Army Barracks, to the 6-story neo-Gothic structure called Jubilee Hall, to the Fisk Memorial Chapel. The greatest treasure, however, I argue, just may be the John Hope and Aurelia Whittington Franklin Library and Special Collections Archive. It is there that I fell in love with history as both a passion and profession, vis-a-vis the story of Fisk and by extension, the story of HBCUs. I call Black colleges the first truly integrated spaces in America. Most histories of HBCUs founded in the post-Civil War period will begin with the story of Northern white missionaries, but it is always important to center Black people as agents in Black stories. It is Black self-determination that ensured and ensures the success of Black schools like Fisk, which persisted not separate or apart, but with the ever-present threats of white violence, white terrorism, and white supremacy. Now, Fisk was opened in 1865, formally dedicated in 1866, but by 1871, the school found itself in disrepair. Students there recalled that there was not money enough even to feed the students. 600 of them enrolled in the institution. It was at that time that students who had begun studying with the treasurer of the institution, who doubled as a music teacher, even though he had no formal musical training, George L. White, found themselves in their free time singing the songs of the slave experience, today known as the spirituals. George L. White, partly out of desperation, partly out of awe, and partly out of courage that few could summon in this moment, arranged that troop to cross the Mason-Dixon line in order to raise money for their school. They departed 150 years ago. On October 6th, they set out as a little band of singers. It is said that White had some inspiration after prayer and returned to them with the name with which they would be known even today, Jubilee Singers, and now more formally the Fisk Jubilee Singers. It was that troop of students that ventured largely across, up and down the American Eastern Seaboard, raising money for their institution before venturing across the Atlantic to Europe, where they would sing before notables ranging from Gladstone to Queen Victoria herself, and would experience a kind of stardom that could only be likened maybe to Beyonce or something of that today. That group of student singers made it possible for FIS to persist today, and not just for FIS to persist today, but also for the many other institutions that were supported by the American Missionary Association, who was just one of the three founding entities that established FISC. And the AMA, let's just say they used the Jubilee Singers as a kind of bottomless purse from which they supported many more schools beyond FISC, but they did make good on the promise to erect Jubilee Hall, which is named for the Jubilee Singers on the campus, which persists even today as the oldest structure erected for the co-education of Black people in the South. FISC found itself in a kind of peculiar privileged position throughout most of its history, given that it had so much of an association with liberal arts instruction up until, I guess, maybe the 70s. It would have been FISC that would have truly been called the Harvard of the South. And that is in no small measure because of the success of its early students, like Dr. Du Bois and many more who went on to make up the professional first truly Black professional class in the nation. You find that there is a tension in the institution. These are the kinds of things you probably will not get on a campus tour, where campus tours are available all day. Most days they are led by student docents who are trained in the lingo of the campus kind of marketing. And you know what they tend to talk about is the famous people associated with the places on the campus. But and that is why I said that Special Collections is perhaps the best place, not just to pass through, but to have the experience of truly understanding the value of FISC, not just as an educational center or a cultural center, but as what I would call a center of resistance. When I write this book, or I should say for Dr. West, finished writing this book, it's definitely one of the things that I argue that places such as FISC are not just the training ground for burgeoning civil rights, but they are civil rights in action. And what you find at a place like FISC, and as a FISCite, we're trained to say that, you know, our school, in mine being FISC, my first alma mater, is exceptional and extraordinary, and more extraordinary than any other place, right? And any other school that's likened to it. And I do think that it is quite special a place, but I also think that there is a specialness at Meharry Medical College, there's a specialness at American Baptist College, there's a specialness at Tennessee State University. Tennessee State University and American Baptist, of course, come along a lot later than FISC, relatively. Meharry Medical College grows out of Central Tennessee University, which is unfortunately no more in existence, but it was the medical and dental department or school of that larger institution. And because Central Tennessee found itself in some difficulties, Reverend Braden, the first president of Meharry, sought to separate it in order to ensure that that it would persist for years to come. But you know what you find at a place like FISC is an extraordinary living history that perhaps one of the best parts of it is that that history will be told to you by and large by a student who by extension they themselves are living, learning examples of the transformative power of Black education for Black people and for the American nation. Dr. Van West said so many things that I was just like, oh, I could connect that to FIST. I could connect that to FIST. I was like, girl, let it go. Like, you don't have to connect everything to FIST, but I truly could. And that's oddly enough, it is quite laughable what I found writing my dissertation, which is a 100-year study of institutions, Black institutions of higher learning in Nashville, is the interconnectedness of all of these stories. Because I wondered, for example, like, you know, why would Buck Colbert name his son John Hope? Like, why do you name a boy Hope? Like, why do you do that? And I had met John Hope Franklin, who is the preeminent historian of the 20th century for Black people and Black stories. And I had never known that, much like Central Tennessee, there was another institution of higher learning, actually on what now stands as the Peabody campus at Vanderbilt, called Tennessee Manual Labor. And it was there that Buck Colbert and his wife were students, and they had a favorite professor, and his name was John Hope. And that John Hope later went on to be the first Black president of Morehouse College for men in Atlanta, Georgia, another HBCU. So when you begin to connect the dots, you see them connecting over and over again. And so if you, for example, put Fisk University into Wikipedia, you would find not just the institution would pop up, but Du Bois would pop up. Diane Nash would pop up, John Lewis would pop up, you know, and there are so many, many more. Not me, not quite, not today, but one day maybe. But there are so many people whose successes are directly related back to their institution of higher learning, especially for Black America, where the degrees of separation were not that great among the professional class. If you could find one person, sure enough, if you go far enough or wide enough, they'll connect to another person. And so what you find is the persistence of Black resistance, the persistence of Black value for education as a tool, not only for personal advancement, but for familial advancement, for community advancement. I say often, these institutions then and now could not really have persisted without Black churches, because you're talking about passing around the proverbial hat, you're talking about taking up a special offering, you're talking about lemonade sales and bake sales and pie sales. And you know, what you find is the interconnectedness of Black self-determination, that whether you decide to go one route or another, which I know really becomes not so much a hang up, but a point of interest for people who think about Black educational history. You know, was it liberal arts, or was it vocational? Was it Du Bois, or was it Booker T? And what I like to say to people is that, you know, Booker T went to school same time that Du Bois did. He graduated like Du Bois graduated. And he argued that the vast, vast majority of Black people would have their future vested in and vested to some kind of manual work. And Du Bois argued that 10% of Black America should focus themselves on the highest ideals of learning, that of the cultivation of the mind through the liberal arts. And I like to leave people with this. If Booker T said the vast majority would focus themselves on manual training, because that would be their reality, and Du Bois said that just 10% of Black America should focus themselves on those things of the mind, Weren't they saying the same thing? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Lots of things to think about that I hadn't really thought about in that exact way before. Always a pleasure. Okay, Laura Holder, you are our final panelist. I'm going to turn over.
All right. Well, those are two great acts to follow, and also Dr. West, but I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this panel as well. And I'm going to delve just a little bit more deeply into the Natchez Street neighborhood, which Dr. West touched on at the end of his presentation. And I know you all are already pretty familiar with that, having seen the film that was put together earlier. And so I think you got a real feel for some of the former residents of the neighborhood and what they experienced. So I'm just going to go back a little bit earlier and then talk about how it just really reflects kind of the transformation of our country really over the last 150, 160 years, and why it's a great case study to look at Reconstruction and Jim Crow and civil rights, and then ultimately the preservation of the neighborhood today. So I'm going to share my screen so that y'all can see some of the images. I think one of the great phrases that came out of this project was from Harvey Chrisman, one of the former residents of the neighborhood, and he called Natchez Street, where he grew up, a city within a city. And this shows kind of part of the streetscape there in Natchez, and then also the Merrill Williams house, which Dr. West mentioned, and I'm going to talk about as well. So I think part of what makes the Natchez Street neighborhood such a compelling place to tell these stories of Reconstruction and Jim Crow and civil rights is its location. It's part of Franklin's urban Civil War battlefield. So where some of the fiercest fighting of the Civil War happened towards the end of the war, that later becomes the town's most prosperous and vibrant African-American neighborhood. So by 1871, the tax rolls in Franklin are showing several Black landowners that have established this free community right there where, you know, we saw the Civil War end, we saw emancipation start. So right there, though, in the shadow of the battlefield, and also right parallel to West Main Street, which was the most, and still is, the most prosperous, white, affluent neighborhood in Franklin. So it's in a really interesting location. And it's also right behind the Carter Farm, now known as the Carter House Historic Site, which was once, when it was developed in the 1950s, really kind of a shrine to the Battle of Franklin. And it's really only recently starting to tell its stories of slavery and emancipation. So you've got this neighborhood that develops with a lot of different things going on right around it. African-American business owner A.N.C. Williams is one of the earliest movers and shakers in this neighborhood. He actually developed his first business during the Civil War. He had a shoe repair business right on the downtown square. And as he continued to grow and develop new opportunities after the war ended, he started buying real estate. And so he made it possible not only to find a location for himself and his family, but really to help other people develop this neighborhood as well. And so the neighborhood really kind of reflects some of those early promises of new freedoms after the Civil War. And the Merrill Williams house is a great example of that because it shows kind of the start of Moses Merrill, formerly enslaved by a man named Charles Merrill, who was actually a big slave trader prior to the Civil War in Nashville and in New Orleans. After the war, by 1881, Moses Merrill's able to purchase this site and build a house on it. And so he's kind of one of the earliest landowners. And then this house, which is still standing today, is also kind of a reflection of how the neighborhood develops. So as Crystal had touched on so eloquently, that early freedom of emancipation also gives way to even greater segregation and Jim Crow laws, which is obviously a big challenge in this neighborhood. Yet the school, which is developing by 1881, several churches which anchor the neighborhood, many thriving businesses, benevolent societies, all of those core institutions that made up these communities help the neighborhood flourish. And despite the significant challenges, I think one of the powerful things about Natchez is it develops into this strong middle-class neighborhood, and it creates a real enclave of solidarity and support for the people that lived in there. It also has the only high school for African-American students in the entire county. So residents from the entire county area flocked to Natchez Street because it became the heart of not just the neighborhood, but also the entire county. But I think what's also interesting is, as you look at the Natchez Street neighborhood, you've got streets that come right off of it: Granbury, Strahl, Carter. For anybody that's familiar with the Battle of Franklin, those are fallen Confederate generals that died during the battle. So even though you're having this very professional, middle-class, successful neighborhood developing right there in Franklin, you've got kind of this constant and painful reminder of those Confederate strongholds that were still remaining long after the war ended, right within the neighborhood itself. So again, going back to kind of this city within a city, you had segregation on its perimeter, but it had such a strong sense of community at its core. You had these very self-sufficient businesses, the Patton Brothers Funeral Home. You had a lot of restaurants. You had neighborhood stores. You had entertainment venues where some of the musical acts that came down from Nashville would come down to play in Franklin as well. You had the Gem Theater. And as Dr. West touched on, you had Franklin's only Green Book House, the only site in the entire city of Franklin that was actually listed in the Green Book. And that was known as Mrs. E.B. Gaylor's guest house. And she advertised for about 10 years there in the neighborhood. And so it's really, again, a big enclave where residents, they acquired property, they raised families, they attained professional and gainful employment, they educated their children, and really built this self-contained, very vital neighborhood. And it developed a really distinct cultural heritage in the midst of those confines and limits of segregation. And again, the only travel safe haven in Franklin for people to come through the community and have a safe place to stay. I think as the century continued, it became a real catalyst for early civil rights. And a big part of that was the urban renewal and public housing initiatives that were developed in the 1950s. Franklin was a small town. This was before the interstates came through. The interstates still haven't really affected it. They didn't come close enough like Tulsa and Nashville and some of your bigger cities really saw. But that didn't stop those pushes for urban renewal and what they called slum clearance and public housing. Those initiatives were still really pressuring this neighborhood. And out of that came a real push in the 1950s for kind of those early civil rights actions that we see a little bit later. And I think a really poignant quote that was in a letter that the neighborhood residents sent to the Franklin Review Appeal, the local paper, showing their frustration and their pain from what was going on during this, says, "We feel we will die in debt and lose our homes. We will try to improve our property in order to meet your approval." You know, those early initiatives to try and work with the city really didn't work. And so that urban renewal push really changed the face of the neighborhood. And you can see in these images some of the public housing developments that came in the late 1950s, another one in 1962, and then also in the 1970s. And another thing during this era that we can really see is how integration changed Natchez Street. And for all of the benefits of that, with the new opportunities that came with that, with the better school facilities and integrated school facilities, those new opportunities beckoned a lot of residents to leave the neighborhood. A lot of the businesses were closed or they were razed during urban renewal. And then the high school graduated its last class in 1967. And again, although that was a really great opportunity for a lot of students, a lot of people felt that kind of the heart of the community, the core, was lost when the school was integrated. All right, so what does that benefit for us today? I know we had some questions about how do we tell these stories to our students? How can we share these stories with our students? Well, I think one of the important things with Natchez Street today, it started about 15 years ago with their early preservation initiatives. And one of the big benefits to the neighborhood was the 2000 nomination to the National Register of Historic Places that the Center for Historic Preservation did. That gave the neighborhood a real stamp of approval in a city like Franklin that really has always prided itself on its historic preservation, but really never preserved its African-American sites. And so that was really the catalyst that got a lot of these projects started. Former resident and historian Thelma Battle has written a couple of books about the neighborhood now, and the African-American Heritage Society has spearheaded several historic markers along the neighborhood street. So you're seeing a real change as this story is being told. The big challenge and the pressure that it faces right now is gentrification. It is one of the fastest growing communities probably in the country at this point. And although so much has been lost over the years, a lot of these core institutional landmarks remain. You can see with a couple of these homes on the side and the buildings on the side, you can see the gentrification and the different styles of homes and businesses that are coming from all sides in the neighborhood. And it's really changing the character. But if we can hang on to these core resources, some of the historic homes, the churches that still have really active congregations today, the Green Book House, which still stands, the school, which still stands, which is a nursing and care facility. There's a real opportunity to tell the stories both locally to our students, our residents, our visitors, but also nationally, because this is a national story. And because so much does still remain in the Natchez Street neighborhood, it's a great place to tell those stories. I think we all recognize that we can't save all the buildings, but we can save the stories, and we can share those stories. So hopefully you've seen the Natchez Street neighborhood has undergone a lot of transformation since its development after the Civil War. It kind of reflects the societal changes that were happening around it, and that makes it a really powerful place to see and experience so much of what's happened over those years. As the neighborhood struggled under the burden of segregation and Jim Crow and times of violence and suffering, it still managed to maintain that amazing sense of community and strength that allowed residents to survive and to thrive. Natchez Street reflects times of tremendous challenge, but it also shows times of really tremendous accomplishment and achievement by the residents that have lived in this neighborhood. And although a lot's been lost, the resources that remain still tell those stories of those core institutions, the churches, the school, the homes, the neighborhood, and the Green Book House. So many of those still stand today. So as the neighborhood continues to experience this rapid change, it still really retains so much of the character and the vibrancy that sustained it for decades. It has tremendous potential to tell the stories of our nation's history. And I think what's so exciting about it is it's the opportunity to tell those stories firsthand. It's a living and it's a still active landscape. And as we can bring residents and visitors, school kids to the neighborhood, they have an opportunity not just to learn and to hear those stories, but to see firsthand where they took place. And those are preservation initiatives that we're working on right now. Dr. West touched on those briefly, but the goal is ultimately to have the Merrill Williams House become kind of a community visitation and orientation center where they can come and learn about the history of the neighborhood, and then send people out into the neighborhood to walk along the street, to see the resources that remain, to see exhibits about the neighborhood and its history, to go across the street to the Green Book, to see what happened there and to learn more, and to really make it a focal point of not just the neighborhood, but the city and their preservation initiatives. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer those.
Thank you so much, Laura. And thanks for showing us some more pictures too. Okay, well, I would like to open this up. If anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask them. Oh, wait. First, I see one in the chat box. So I'm going to go ahead and read that one first, and then we'll just take it from there. So the first question looks like it is directed at you, Dr. deGregory. were there rules or constraints on the types of courses that HBCUs could offer in order to qualify for funding from the state or federal governments? And then did the Jubilee Singers allow Fisk to remain open by providing monies for the university?
I'll start with the last first. Yeah, so the Jubilee Singers really ensured the persistence of Fisk. If you look at the timeline, you know, we're already in the 1870s. The goodwill of former Union Army officers such as Clinton B. Fisk, for whom Fisk is named, the well had kind of run dry by then. And the white South was being reclaimed. And so it was really up to Black people to find ways to fund these institutions to keep them open. The Fisk University Jubilee Singers raised by the end of their first series of tours in 1878, I think the equivalent of some maybe $4 million today. And so that money definitely was used not only, as I said, to erect Jubilee Hall, which, well, first to purchase the current site of Fisk University, but also to erect Jubilee Hall, and the American Missionary Association, which was responsible for the administration of the institution, used that money to support other AME schools like Talladega College and others of that nature. The most enduring value of the Jubilee Singers, kind of cultural historians would argue, is the preservation of the musical art form of the spirituals themselves. The singers' success, of course, spurred on a number of troupes that performed under the name Jubilee Singers. They would adopt the name of their institution, maybe like, let's just say Fred Loudon, who was a member of the Singers, had a troupe themselves. And so they would be called the Loudon Jubilee Singers, and different schools had different Jubilee Singers. And that's why it became important for the Jubilee Singers at Fisk to create the distinction that they were and are the Fisk Jubilee Singers. In terms of federal and state funding, I don't think that that was the biggest line or most important line of demarcation in terms of the curriculum of these institutions. First, I'll say that there have been studies in recent years that have shown that when you compare an institution like Tuskegee, which was founded by Booker T. Washington, to say Fisk University or something else, you won't find that much difference. You'll find that Tuskegee offered liberal arts courses, as Fisk offered manual and industrial courses as well. So there's a lot of crossover. In fact, Booker T, if any single Black person had the greatest influence on education, even at Fisk, it would have been Booker T, because not only did his kind of propagandizing help to underwrite Tuskegee, but also a place such as Fisk, and on which he served on the board of trustees. During a campus visit, it's where he met his wife, Margaret Murray Washington, who was a student and a graduate at Fisk, who was also on the newspaper staff of the Fisk Herald with W.B. Du Bois. And Booker T. Washington sent all of his sons to Fisk University. So really, what you find is the effort to satisfy kind of white philanthropic funders by, these outward pronouncements of what kind of school these institutions were. And I'll just close by saying, for example, when you talk about civil rights, which still there's so much left to be discovered, you would think like a place like Tennessee A&I, where its student activists were actually expelled, was, their president must have been much more conservative, Walter Davis, than the president of Fisk. And actually the inverse was true. he privately, as he could, supported student activists. Walter Strother Davis did at Tennessee A&I, while Diane Nash tells me that the inverse was true at Fisk. The then president's public pronouncement was, of course, very liberal arts inclined, very much in support of civil rights. But she said that, privately, he gave them hell. He did not want them to protest because, this was interrupting the philanthropic train. And most people will argue that it was the end of the golden age at Fisk when its students took to the forefront of the movement. White philanthropic dollars went away, and we're still waiting on them to return.
I have a follow-up for you, Dr.
Sure.
deGregory, a follow-up question. That question was from Helen Prince, and the next one is from Robert Scarlett. And he asked, did Diane Nash and John Lewis graduate from Fisk, or were they just there attending classes? Like, what was their connection?
Diane Nash did not graduate. John Lewis did. He graduated from Fisk after having graduated first from American Baptist. So although we like to claim him as Fisk's own, American Baptist probably has a greater claim to him, as they do as well to James Bevel, who was the ex-husband of Diane Nash. And so Diane, who I speak to infrequently, joined the movement full time and left education. Fortunately, she and the graduates of Tennessee State, although separately, lived long enough to be honored by their respective institutions. The Tennessee State activists all received honorary degrees, those that were expelled, and Diane Nash was also awarded an honorary doctorate, I think of letters at Fisk.
Thanks. I remember when Diane Nash came to MTSU to do a big public talk, and it was just one of the most amazing experiences, hearing her talk about their active philosophy of nonviolence and love embodied in their actions. And I hope that we'll get to learn more about her story when we move to the next segment of our fellowship, which will be the modern civil rights movement. So we'll bring that up again in a few months. But yeah, her story is just incredible. And thank you for telling us more about that. Kira and I learn new things every single time we hear about this stuff. So we learn as well as everybody else. Now, I know that somebody on Flipgrid asked, well, actually, there were probably lots of questions asked in your Flipgrid videos, but I do remember one that I think might be very easy for John Lodl to answer, because it's about the cemetery community. And when you and when Dr. Lydia Simpson are talking about the cemetery community, the way we talk about it was, oh, right down the road from the battlefield. And I think that, in some parts, depending on what you're talking about, just down the road can mean like next door, or it can mean like 30 miles down the road. So will you revisit that sense of, I know I love how you said blinking if you miss it, because I lived in Murfreesboro for years before I realized that there was that community there. I'd passed it on the road so many times, but can you give us a bit more of a sense of just how close it is to the battlefield and the National Cemetery?
Yeah, it's right there. So the history of cemetery is interesting because the original community formed basically where the Stones River National Battlefield Visitor Center and parking lot is today. So the acreage that encompasses the national park today, the core of that is where cemetery community originally was. And then your legacy story is 1927, the federal government, 27 to 29, the federal government wants to establish the national park to recognize the battlefield site. And they move all the residents off their properties through eminent domain. And the citizens literally picked up and moved up the street, so north of the visitor center on Old Nashville Highway. And they literally picked up one church and moved it on logs, is the oral history. Another church they dismantled and rebuilt. The third church was already located north of today's park boundary, so it did not have to be relocated. And of course, the residents lost their houses and had to rebuild. Yeah, it's right there where the battlefield is today. It's a remarkable story. The battlefield is slowly starting to tell that story with the help of folks like Dr. West and other professors and individuals out of MTSU specifically, to say, you know, there's more of a history at the battlefield than just the Battle of Stones River. And it's a very important history that needs to be told. One thing that I did not talk about, maybe we touched on the video and I didn't talk about today, that I need to check with Dr. Gregory about, is Tennessee Manual Labor University, we claim was founded at Stones River Battlefield in the cemetery community in its inception, and later moved to Nashville, but we need to clarify that history. So there was a chance that Murfreesboro could have been the Tuskegee of Alabama, and was not. The school fell through. They acquired 300 acres. They built some buildings. They started education of students on that Tuskegee model of manual labor, but they lost their funding. Things fell through, and they moved on.
Yeah, I if I could just interject here, just one point of clarification. So the institution that is no longer in existence at Vanderbilt is rather Roger Williams University. Okay. And so Tennessee Manual Labor has the great claim of being the only historically Black institution, although it did not persist, founded by Black people in Middle Tennessee.
Yes.
And so I one of the things that relates to my earlier research is the existence of native or clandestine Black schools, which people say, well, if it was a secret, how do you know? It was kind of like an open secret in Nashville prior to the Civil War. And the founders of of Tennessee Manual, much like Ella Shepherd Moore, who would become the principal face of the Jubilee Singers. Also, Fiss's first true college graduate, Virginia Walker Broughton. They were all students of Daniel Watkins in his native school. And so that is the larger argument of the dissertation, is that these institutions could not merely be products of kind of white architecture for Black education, because there were Black products of these institutions who had already had some experience with education, who brought to Freedmen schools their own desires, if you will, and their own purposes for what education would mean to and for their lives.
All right, thanks to you both for that, because that was, the Manual College was something I had never even heard of until John and Lydia started talking about it that very day. And I grew up here in Murfreesboro, and it's just astounding that even as a historian who's done local history, I still have so much to learn. So it's always exploration, and there's always stories out there. And speaking of stories, again, with the cemetery community, I know that it made it kind of confusing when we were talking about the cemetery community and benevolent cemetery, but I think it was all clear to everybody from the video why the cemetery community was called that, because of the National Cemetery. But was that an intentional thing, John? Do you know? Is there any way to know? Or is that just something that was referred to like that so much it just became the name?
I don't know if we have a clear answer on that from the historical record. There was a railroad depot, train stop established there by the 1880s into the 1890s, called Cemetery Stop. So we're not sure where the original community name came from, or at what point it came into existence. The name came into existence.
Okay. I mean, it makes sense that the rail stop would be called cemetery because that's how they got all the bodies to the burial ground to rebury them, right? Transported by rail car, I'm sure. At least part of the way.
Most of the bodies are moved by wagon, but because cemeteries before we had establishment of the park systems, either state, federal, local, cemeteries become that draw, especially on Memorial Days, cemetery, gravestone marking days. So it becomes a visitor destination. And so when I mentioned the train stop, that's one of the earliest records of it having that name. But there again, I don't know where the name came from or when it was named prior to that.
Okay. Thanks for that. Okay, this might be a question for you, Laura. Connie Fink has in the chat box asked a question about the Patton Brothers funeral home, which it moved to Edgeville from Franklin. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
The Patton Brothers Funeral Home, actually the building that they used for many years is still standing. It has another use now, but that was one of the really preeminent African-American names right after the Civil War in the Franklin community. And their funeral home was established very early in the Natchez Street neighborhood. And then I think moved a connection to Nashville. The Patton Brothers or the Patton family in the Natchez Street neighborhood also had a really rich history of being part of the military. So you've got a really rich, particularly a World War II military connection to that family as well, with Thomas Patton as one of the early Tuskegee Airmen. So that family was a really far-reaching family with a great base in Franklin, but then moving on to other parts, both locally and in Nashville, and again, nationally with the Tuskegee Airmen. So it's a great story. Like I think all these communities have, there's so many layers, and it's hard to touch on all of those layers when you're trying to just share a little bit of information. But yeah, the connections, like Crystal said, you've got those connections that branch out, that start in these communities right after the Civil War during Reconstruction, but they continue to just grow and expand, and the ripple effect of their influence is just shown, I think, across Middle Tennessee and beyond.
And funeral homes are actually, they're an extremely important institution in African-American communities because of the segregated nature of burial after the Civil War. And when you walk among a lot of African-American cemeteries, you see a preponderance of funeral home markers, those little supposed to be temporary plaques in the ground. And sometimes those turn into permanent markers. And I love when they're mounted in concrete or they're somehow incorporated into tombstones and made permanent. I love to see that. But when you get to take your students to a cemetery, because I'm really excited for that, look for different funeral home names that you can find on those kinds of markers and have your students do some research into those, because those are extremely prominent, very well-respected institutions among the African-American communities in just about any kind of town in the South. And
one just quick thing I would add, although you had the Patton Brothers Funeral Home and you had the Natchez Street neighborhood, the primary African-American cemetery in Franklin is actually just a few miles away, Toussaint Louverture Cemetery in the Hard Bargain neighborhood, it's a fantastic cemetery. Just like Stacy said, so many stories that can be told about the residents that lived there. But what we're trying to do eventually is tie a lot of these resources, whether it's a walking tour, a driving tour, or materials for teachers to tell that story. As Franklin continues to grow, we really want to tie all those resources together. But it is, I think, interesting in the Natchez Street neighborhood, when you've had so much there, the cemetery, the primary African-American cemetery, is located in another African-American neighborhood in town.
I thought that was interesting too, Laura. But the Toussaint Louverture Cemetery is a fascinating site, named after, of course, the man who led the Haitian revolution for independence. So that's a really cool nod to history and a conscience of the importance and significance of that kind of site for African Americans
Right.
here in Tennessee.
And I don't know if this was actually the reason, but Natchez Street, as we talked about, was really already surrounded by some core neighborhoods and some development even in the 1860s. And it may have been that they just didn't have space for it there.
And plus it's right across the street from 2 other historic cemeteries in Franklin. So sometimes cemeteries just grow up next to other cemeteries, even Black ones next to white ones. It's pretty common. Any other questions?
So one thing that's kind of popped in my mind that we've not really touched on, because we've talked about a lot of these different, communities and their importance. And we've talked a little bit about how like urban renewal and, successes of the civil rights movement with desegregation kind of impacted them. But even before that, we haven't touched on how the Great Migration impacted these communities in the South. So I wondered if our panelists, if you guys had any thoughts about, how we could incorporate that into the stories of the importance of these communities.
One of the stories that there's always a story, there's always a connection. One of the stories that emerged from, again, my dissertation research, which I have no knowledge of, was the story of a 17-year-old graduate of Central Tennessee's kind of regular school program. And so she was leaving to go out and to become a school teacher. And she hadn't arrived in a neighboring community, not even 3 days later, before she was gunned down in the house where she had found room and boarding. And what I found was that there was this guy who was sent on behalf of the family to collect the body. And he called himself a carpenter, but he had turned into a coffin maker because there were just so many deaths. And he was Benjamin Pap Singleton, and he would lead the exodus to Kansas. And this was one of when he testified before some federal body, this was one of the examples that he gave, the fact that he had to go and pick up the body of 17-year-old Julia Hayden, and he was just over, and he was, they were going to move. And so you do find that those patterns of migration really impact communities in kind of strange ways. I always, if I meet someone and they say they're from a place like Detroit, I'm like, you're from Detroit? They're like, yeah. I'm like, is your mom from Detroit? I used to do this with my students at Tennessee State. They'll be like, yeah. I'm like, is your grandma from Detroit? Nah, she from Alabama. Nah, she from Mississippi. And so they were always just kind of like, maybe not, certainly one, maybe 2 generations removed from the Black South. And I think another point or connection rather that can be made is kind of like the return to the South, especially for Black people who had moved to all these other places and like, you know what, I'll just go home. And so you find that the inverse is true, and migratory patterns are very frustrating, because what you will find is a place like the Jefferson Street District, which of course is the home of Tennessee State, Fisk, and Meharry Medical College. When they plowed the interstate through that community, all of these people, first thing you find is the living, learning environments. And so these communities spring up largely around kind of Union Army holdouts. It's the Freedmen's, they went to the Contraband Camp and now they're out and they just kind of settle nearby. And those communities build outwards. And so the communities around lots of Black colleges traditionally and historically have been overwhelmingly white. And I don't know the name of this great satire writer. Someone may know. I don't think it was Miss Cheap. It's a white lady who died, but she wrote like maybe 15 years ago, the satirical piece about how Fisk, Jubilee Hall was being turned into condos. And everyone was like, oh, that could never happen. I said, why would, because people are like, what? And just like, of course it's satire, but it's not so far-fetched today. I mean, this actually could become condos if you let people make them that. And so what you find is those campuses were living, learning environments where, for example, the Special Collections Library at the time of which I was a student, Beth Madison House, who was the great granddaughter of Ella Shepherd Moore, the original Jubilee singer, you know, she grew up and one of her neighbors was John Work III and his wife Agnes, and then his sister. And then on the other side, it was someone else, and a door down, it was Aaron Douglas. And so she grew up in a community where there was lots of economic integration, even if there was not racial integration. And then you find, again, with the successes of the civil rights movement, Black people moving out of these decayed urban epicenters into the suburbs, the decline of the value for these homes in these communities. And so people, upwardly mobile people, are trying to move out because they're trying to make a future for themselves. And if you're building, if you're not born wealthy and you're trying to build some assets for yourself, you know, your home is your greatest investment. So you want to make the best investment you can. And largely that's outside of these decaying communities. And, you know, now you look up and you get the okie doke where everyone's moving from the suburbs back into the city. And so I think that these are intersections of the past and the present and the future all together that can be easily made for, you know, not just the large scale great migration that we think of out of the South into industrial cities, but just migration in and around cities that we live in today. And I also think that that's very important and a great opportunity for people to see how patterns of development and home ownership are really no different today in terms of what I like to call the okie doke than they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago. It's, you know, it's the same game.
And there's a similar story with the Green Book House along the Natchez Street neighborhood, building on deGregory said. The woman, later Mrs. E.B. Gaylor, that ran that, actually first got married when she was 17 years old, and she and her first husband went to Detroit and then migrated from Detroit to Chicago. In the 1930s, get divorced, and her husband stays there and raises another family, stays in the Chicago area until he dies in the 1960s. She comes back to Franklin, gets remarried, and is able to purchase that home. It's a long story that I won't go into all the details about, but she actually comes back kind of before that post-civil rights era when people did start moving back a little bit more often. But there are a lot of great stories along those same lines, especially doing research into the Nashville Globe, and to read all the great stories about entertaining in the Natchez Street neighborhood and family members that are coming back that had migrated to places like Chicago and Detroit, and what a big deal it was when they came back to the neighborhood and the way they were shown so much hospitality, and people wanted to show whatever they could there in the Natchez Street neighborhood to those relatives that had migrated. So lots of interesting stories and connections that you can tell, both people leaving the neighborhood, but then also a lot of people coming back.
Yeah, that's one of the great successes of FIST too, into its golden period, is the rehousing or homing, if you will, of displaced Harlem Renaissance figures. I mean, if you talk about Charles S. Johnson, you talk about Honor Bontops, you talk about Aaron Douglas, you know, these were all people who were moving and shaking in the Black North, who had returned to the South, and through institutions, schoolhouses like Fisk, were able to kind of reestablish themselves. Zora Neale Hurston's story may have been a different one. She had been recruited by Charles S. Johnson. This is just a story that you may not have heard before. She'd been recruited by Charles S. Johnson, the great anthropologist, to teach, you know, because she needed something to do. And so he told her, he was like, okay, you know, great, here are your courses or whatever. And he's like, yeah, so we're going to need like a syllabus. And she was like, a what? And he was like, you know, we're going to need some record of what y'all are doing. And she was like, nah, I don't do that. And so her tenure at FIS was not, because she could not work within those confines, but for far, so many. And this would also include displaced Jewish intellectuals who would come from Europe, and they would also find homes at Black colleges. And so again, you know, you find the story of migration and movement and rehoming, you know, much larger than even just a Black story.
Well, thank you guys so much. And right now we are getting close to the end of our time. So any last questions from our teachers?
I have a quick one that I think Laura can answer. I think I missed something. So with Natchez Street, the identity of it, you said shifted, not so much because of urban renewal, but more of like because the school integrated. Did I hear that right?
I think it was really a combination of both of those factors, because it was, again, it really developed again right after the Civil War. It had a real period of thriving within those confines of segregation and struggle. The urban renewal of the 1950s definitely really changed the face of the neighborhood. It just took out so many structures, even though the reasons for a lot of that dilapidation was because the city had neglected it for so long. But that changed the face of a lot of it, but there were still a lot of those core homes and churches and institutions that were still there. And those churches still are there. They are still very active and vibrant congregations. But I think what really, when you talk to the people that had lived and grown up in that neighborhood, when the school closed, because it had been such of a source of pride and identity for the neighborhood, the football team and the band, so many of the teachers and principals lived right there in the neighborhood. They were part of the families that lived in that neighborhood. It was the school brought in people from like the community I live in, rural College Grove, not so rural anymore, but I've talked to people where they spent an hour and a half getting on the train and walking or catching rides to get to the high school in the Natchez Street neighborhood because it was the only one in the entire county. So urban renewal, again, obviously had a big impact on the neighborhood when the school closed, and when the civil rights movement, there were just a lot more opportunities to gain an education, to start a business, to move somewhere and try something new. That's really when the neighborhood started to go into decline, which actually in a way preserved a lot of the structures that we're trying to work with now.
Thank you.
Yeah, to piggyback on Laura, I don't mean to piggyback, but I can't resist. If you want to kill a community, you close its schools. And it's just that simple. And that's why education is so political. It is so political. The idea that integration is a wonderful idea when Black kids have to get on buses and, you know, be bused for hours before they even get to the schoolhouse where, you know, they'll be treated as invaders, is, you know, true, especially, you know, even in the case of Nashville, when you talk about, you know, closing Pearl to merge with Cone, and now, you know, Pearl Cone it's a challenging place, and the Pearl structure is a wonderful place of opportunity, but it's no longer overwhelmingly Black. It's hardly Black at all, right? And so, you know, that's the okie doke. You know, people like, oh, it's not about race. It's about opportunity. It's about community. It's about being together. Yeah, but I mean, and that's why I say that Black colleges are one of the first truly integrated places in America. And I should have said this to you too. You know, one of the benefits of educators visiting these campuses is that students are aware that they are viable options for them to receive higher education. And fortunately for white people, this is not exclusive to Black people. I think the great gift of Black college campuses, much like Black churches, if white people would attend them in mass, which they largely don't, is that this is an opportunity to be together with Black people on Black people's terms. And in every other space in the American experience, that togetherness is largely on white people's terms. And so I think that it's wonderful, even though it's not free of racist or white supremacist ideas, because the American historian Ibram X. Kendi has argued this, that we all can be consumers of racist ideas, even Black people, unfortunately. We can't be racist, but we can be consumers of racist ideas. We can think about Blackness as a deficiency, certainly as different in ways in which are not advantageous. And so, Black colleges become centers of Black respectability in order to satisfy white gaze and, white appetites for how Black people should behave. And so that is why, in large part, even to your earlier question, while a school like this would not have been subject to state and federal mandates about its curriculum, all of the other HBCUs founded after the turn of the 20th century, by and large, would have been born of the Second Morrill Act. And so they bear those A&I, A&M, or formerly bore those associations, not just in the naming of their institution, be agricultural and industrial, agricultural and mechanical, but also in the nature of the institutions themselves. As prescribed by land grant institutions, they definitely would have also had a focus in those themes that emerge out of other land grant college institutions.
Thank you, Crystal. So I want to again thank all of our panelists for joining us tonight. You guys have shared with us so much information. I think really gives us a chance to think about a lot of different things and think about these sites, not just the ones we've talked about specifically tonight, but even sites in other communities across our 3 states that we're looking at here. So just a couple quick things as we think about next steps. Our next session is on Wednesday, December the 8th, and we're going to be spending about an hour and a half max exploring digital collections and resources that you guys can use in your lesson plans and in developing materials for your classrooms. So that session, if you can join us live, you're welcome to do so. That will give you a chance to ask us questions about maybe specific things that you're looking for. If you are not able to join us live, we will be posting a recording of that, but again, you are welcome to do so. And then after that, you and your partners will be beginning to think about what your topic choice and primary sources are going to be for the lesson plan that you will write for the Reconstruction and Jim Crow section. And so we'll have you guys posting those by January 7th. And then your lesson plans will need to be completed by January the 28th. And so that gives you time over the holiday break, as well as into the new year to kind of work on those. If you have any questions, of course, you feel free to reach out to us and we will be happy to address those. So again, I want to thank you guys for your time and attention tonight. I know many of you, it's made for a long first day back after a holiday break. So again, thank you guys so much for that. We really do appreciate it. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.